Thanks, Elizabeth. And thank you, everyone, for attending this evening. 2 weeks ago, my sister-in-law, Terry King, gave a talk on Sanskrit, the language of the gods. And I'm very grateful to her because it reminded me that it is common practice when studying the scriptures in Sanskrit to start with an invocation. This is a powerful way to bring us together and put us in the most conducive state to receive the message. It also reminds us of our true natures and asks for the powers to assist us in our understanding. The following is part of an invocation at the beginning of the Mandukya Upanishad. Madame Blavatsky makes reference to the Mandukya Upanishad in the first fundamental proposition to be found in the proem to the Secret Doctrine. I will sound the invocation in Sanskrit, and then Elizabeth will give an English translation. Bhadram karnebi srinuyama deva Bhadram pashyemakshabir yajatra Stirai rangais tushtuan sastanu bir Vyashema devahitam yatayu.
Om, O gods, may we hear auspicious words with the ears. While engaged in sacrifices, may we see auspicious things with the eyes. While praising the gods with steady limbs, may we enjoy a life that is beneficial to the gods. Peace, peace, peace.
Just one note before I start. There will be a good number of quotations which will be put on the screen. These are very profound, and each one would be worthy of an evening of discussion on its own. This talk extols the virtue of silence, and so I hope you'll stay with me when after each quote we do not move on rapidly without a break, and I pause for a few seconds before continuing, just allowing a little time for reflection. The Indian saint Sri Ramakrishna tells a story about men who went into a mango grove, and they started to count the leaves and twigs, and they compared the size and color and carefully noted this down, and they held great discussions on the matter, which was very interesting. But another man went into the mango grove and just ate the mangoes. Who was the wisest? This is not an easy question to answer. This story creates a dilemma in my mind. Although I think the story is meant to encourage the tasting of the fruit, does it mean that all the background work is unnecessary? In my experience, meaningful study is essential for appreciation, and it leads to the fruit. But this story tells us that above all, it is necessary to taste the fruit. I believe that Meister Eckhart would have thought the same. He warned against becoming so involved with the background work that you forget to taste the fruit. He expresses it in different words, but I believe the meaning is the same. Eckhart was an academic and was considered one of the great theologians of his time, and hence his title Meister, which was the product of him spending 2 long periods at the University of Paris. Incidentally, I have purposely not put a lot of biographical notes about Meister Eckhart, because I know that these are all available on Google. So I should have perhaps said at the beginning, he lived between 1260 and 1328, I think. His academic works were written in Latin, which I have yet to study, but his sermons were written in the vernacular, which is known as Middle High German. They were delivered mostly to the beguines, who were women who lived in religious communities but were not part of the monastic orders. And they also gave the sermons to more ordinary congregations. The sermons are more understandable to non-academics, and yet are still full of many concepts which are not commonplace. An example is where he recommends that we should be as we were when we were not. A concept which I think most of us would struggle to understand, but I hope will become clearer later on. The sermons have been translated by a number of translators over the last 200 years, but more recently, Maurice O'Connell Walsh has given us a highly acclaimed translation to work from, which he completed in 1987. And these are available to everyone as a free download. In the chat, there will be a link to this download, and a copy of the quotations used tonight will also be available. The power of language is unfathomable. Swami Vivekananda, a follower of Sri Ramakrishna, talks about going into a room of musical instruments, and when a sound is made, certain instruments in the room will vibrate in sympathy. Similarly, something inside one responds to language. And this is what happens to me when I hear the words of Meister Eckhart. Even though they have possibly been weakened by translation, they still have enormous power because he is speaking from the very depth of his being, and even from beyond being, where description goes beyond words. This inevitably results in the hearer not always being able to understand the meaning at an intellectual level. Our understanding is limited by our own state of being. And yet, it is miraculous that even without fully understanding, the meaning of the words can still have an effect. The words bypass our discursive mind and penetrate to the depths of our being. This creates a magical effect, whereby one's being reverberates just like the musical instruments. Not everyone will respond in the same way and at the same time to this. In my own case, it took a number of years for the penny to drop. I only persevered because I was using it as an aid to help me to get to sleep. One night it penetrated, and from that moment on, a light began to dawn. I hope you will feel the power of the Meister's words tonight. But if it leaves you unmoved, then it does not matter. I knew of Meister Eckhart 40 years ago, and it is only in the last 6 or 7 that it has become meaningful to me. A question most of us want answered is, what should I be doing with my life? Everywhere there are teachers of different qualities who might try to help us answer this question. Often following the instructions of a teacher is difficult. But even if we succeed, we are left with another problem, namely that it strengthens the idea of I am the doer. The Bhagavad Gita specifically tells us that we are not the doer, and we should renounce the fruits of all action, both good and bad. In chapter 3 of the Gita, we are told that it is only the ignorant man who, misled by personal egotism, says, I am the doer. Coincidentally, it goes on to say that one should act without attachment, which is another major theme of Eckhart's teachings. In Sermon 1, according to the order set out by Walsh, the subject is the birth of the word in the soul. This sermon, which was delivered on Christmas Day, begins with, here in time we are celebrating the eternal birth which God the Father bore and bears unceasingly in eternity. And he goes on to quote St. Augustine, which says, what does it avail me that this birth is always happening if it does not happen in me? From the description Eckhart gives, this birth of the word would seem to be the same as what the Eastern tradition refers to as yoga or union. It is the complete negation of everything that is not God. In fact, even God himself as a concept is finally negated. Eckhart returns to this theme many times in his sermons, and it's a really important subject which is worthy of a lot of study. But for this evening, I would like to look at the second question that Eckhart poses in this sermon, which is, should I do something to precipitate this birth, or should I remain passive? Elizabeth? His answer follows.
Whether it is more profitable for a man to cooperate with it, so that it may come to pass in him through his own exertion and merit, by a man's creating in himself a mental image in his thoughts and disciplining himself that way by reflecting that God is wise, omnipotent, eternal, or whatever else he can imagine about God. Whether this is more profitable and conducive to this birth from the Father, or whether one should shun and free oneself from all thoughts, words, and deeds, and from all images created by the understanding, maintaining a wholly God-receptive attitude, such that one's own self is idle, letting God work within one. Which conduct conduces best to this birth?
At first sight, it looks as if Eckhart is going to say that it is good to exert oneself and use mental imaging and so forth in order for the birth of the word to take place. But when we read on to the second option, it is clear that he is saying that the second approach is the correct one, namely that of maintaining a wholly God-receptive attitude, such that one's own self is idle, letting God work within one. Now, if this is the case, why should we study anything? Why do so many teachings extol the virtue of studying the scriptures? Why did Eckhart himself spend so many years at the University of Paris, culminating in his title of Meister? According to Plato, opinion, even right opinion, is an inferior class of knowledge. Only real knowing has true validity. And this knowing is more like an unknowing, as we will hear later in Eckhart's words. And this brings me to the crux of what I would like to suggest about study. Namely, that the purpose of the study of the scriptures is not to stimulate thinking or to increase ordinary knowing, but to bring about stillness. Of all the qualities which are likely to bring about transformation, stillness is supreme. Patanjali's Yoga Sutras are a complete analysis of achieving union with the Absolute. And the second sutra states that yoga is establishing the mind in stillness. And how similar is this to Eckhart's own, the most powerful prayer, one well nigh omnipotent, and the worthiest of all is the outcome of a quiet mind. The quieter the mind, the more powerful, the deeper, the more telling, and the more perfect the prayer is. To a quiet mind, all things are possible. Here are 3 quotes from Sermon 1. Therefore, it is impossible for you to be beatified by any image whatsoever. And therefore, there must be a silence and stillness. And the Father must speak in that. They must know that the very best and noblest attainment in this life is to be silent and let God work and speak within. This not knowing makes her, the soul, wonder and leads her to eager pursuit, for she perceives clearly that it is, but does not know how or what it is. And so this unknown knowing keeps the soul constant and yet spurs her on to pursuit. It is clear from these words that study cannot therefore be for the purpose of accumulating knowledge, which just fills the mind. In fact, often Eckhart encourages us to be empty of all images. An image is anything that comes from outside, and the birth of the word is said to come from the inside, like a welling up, overflowing, ebullient, which is from the Latin bullio, to boil over. It is also clear that creating a sense of wonder is not understandable, but is nevertheless important because it spurs you on. Eckhart also says that wherever we leave space, God must enter, not from the outside. God has no choice but to fill this empty space with himself, but only if nothing else is present, as we can see in the next quotation.
I never asked God to give himself to me. I beg him to purify, to empty me. If I am empty, God of his very nature is obliged to give himself to me, to fill me.
Consider this. God, who is omnipotent, has no freedom of choice. And yet we, who are far from omnipotent, are so proud and protective of our freedom to choose. It is interesting to note that it is only on account of our muddled minds that choice becomes an option. When the mind is perfectly quiet, there is no choice. Someone with a quiet mind does not ever have to think, what shall I do?
Now, a master, Aristotle, says, no man is so foolish that he does not desire wisdom. Why, therefore, do we not become wise? Much is required for this. The main thing is that a man must pass through and transcend all things and the causes of all things. And a man becomes weary of this, and so man stays in his pettiness. If I am a rich man, that does not make me wise. But if I am informed with the essence of wisdom and its nature being wisdom itself, then I am a wise man.
Please note that Aristotle says we have to pass through and transcend all things and the causes of all things. I do not think I'm alone in wanting to be knowledgeable about things, but we have to go beyond all things to become wise. Anyone who seeks anything in God, knowledge, understanding, devotion, or whatever it might be, though he may find it, he will not have found God. Even though he may indeed find knowledge understanding, or inwardness, which I heartily commend, but it will not stay with him. But if he seeks nothing, he will find God and all things in him, and they will remain with him. In the next quote, there's a word which I hadn't come across before. The word is thralls. And you might like to know that the word thralls means slaves. The just man seeks nothing in his works. For those who seek anything in their works, or work for any why, are thralls and hirelings. Therefore, if you would be informed with and transformed into justice, have no ulterior purpose in your work. Allow no why to take shape in you, as regards either time or eternity, reward or blessedness, or this or that. For in truth, such works are all dead. Indeed, even if you create an image of God in your mind, the works you do with that in view are all dead, and your good works are ruined. Eckhart develops this theme further. In Sermon 87, which is on the Beatitude, "Blessed are the poor in spirit," Eckhart by steps takes away all those props that we rely upon before describing the poor in spirit as having nothing, wanting nothing, knowing nothing. To begin with, he deals with having nothing that goes beyond normal considerations of what that means. In the next quotation from Sermon 87, he tells a story about St. Francis of Assisi.
We read of him that he was once walking with one of his companions when they met a poor man. He, St. Francis, said to his companion, "This man has disgraced us and put us to shame, for he is poorer than we are." Take note of these words, that he considered himself disgraced when he found anyone who was poorer than himself. I used sometimes to say, and it is quite true, that whoever truly loves poverty is so desirous of it that he grudges anyone having less than he has. And so it is with all things, whether it is purity or justice or whatever virtue he loves. He wants to have it in the highest degree. He always wants to reach the highest degree attainable in time, and cannot endure that there should be anything above him. He always wants to take the highest place. Love is not satisfied as long as something more exists with which one can love. This saint loved poverty so much that he could not endure anyone being poorer than himself. The poorer the man is in spirit, the more he is detached and makes naught of all things. The poorer he is in spirit, the more truly he possesses all things, and the more they are his own.
If even St. Francis is put out because someone is poorer than himself, what does that say about us? Are we able to be so completely detached from our actions that we do not make these comparisons? And although Eckhart does not say so, it seems to me that St. Francis still suffers from egoism because he wants to be the poorest. The sermon continues.
So we say that a man should be so poor that he either is nor has any place for God to work in. To preserve a place is to preserve distinction. Therefore, I pray to God to make me free of God, for my essential being is above God, taking God as the origin of creatures. For in that essence of God, in which God is above being and distinction, there I was myself and knew myself so as to make this man. Therefore, I am my own cause, according to my essence, which is eternal, and not according to my becoming, which, sorry, I can't see the bottom of my screen because
Temporal.
temporal. Thank you. Does it go on?
Yes, it does.
Therefore, I am unborn, and according to my unborn mode, I can never die. According to my unborn mode, I have eternally been, am now and shall eternally remain. That which I am by virtue of birth must die and perish, for it is mortal, and so must perish with time. In my birth, all things were born, and I was the cause of myself and all things. And if I had so willed it, I would not have been, and all things would not have been. If I were not, God would not be either. I am the cause of God's being God. If I were not, then God would not be God. But you do not need to know this.
This is Eckhart at his most mystic, and it was words like this that opened him up to accusations of heresy towards the end of his life. In the Indian tradition, there is a distinction between Brahman, the unspeakable, beyond creation, and beyond description, and the creator God, Brahma, who is the creator of the universe. It is said that there are many Brahmas, and they are subject to a lifespan. If I have understood correctly, Eckhart here is making a similar distinction when he says to be free of God, when he asks to be free of God, and that his essential being is above God. He asserts that his unborn mode has eternally been, is now, and shall eternally remain. It is the same as what he says about the birth of the Word, and from which I deduce that the birth of the Word is the true eternal self. While you think of yourself as distinct, you are firmly in the world of things and are likely to be subject to a cloudy mind, in a world of multiplicity rather than unity. I would suppose, but do not know, that if you could be established in stillness, then one would taste the mangoes. And just later this afternoon, after writing, I wrote this talk some days ago, but we came across a quote which was actually a footnote in the Welsh translations, which perhaps explains what I've been saying here a bit better. And he quotes somebody called Quint. Quint was the person who gathered together all the sermons of Meister Eckhart, and so created the sort of complete German archive. And Walsh, the translator, dedicated his translations to Quint, who he obviously thought very, very highly of. Well, Quint makes the following observations, which I think is relevant to what we've just been discussing.
On this whole passage, Quint says, what Eckhart says here concerns the existence of man before his creation, an idea in the actus purus, which means a pure act or pure actuality. So an idea in the pure actuality of the divine ground of being, where the idea of individual man is in essential unity with the Godhead, in which therefore I had and knew no God. The distinction between God and Godhead, as Eckhart sometimes put it, is brought out in a parallel adduced by Quint from Prager's Geschichte der deutschen Mystik 1. I have sometimes said, I am a cause for God's being God. God has himself from the soul, his Godhead from himself. For before creatures were, God was not God, but he was Godhead, and that he does not have from the soul. And with different terminology, Eckhart writes in the second Genesis commentary, it should be known that God is, and is from eternity called God, but Lord is more properly said in regard to time. For when creatures began to be, God came to be called Creator and Lord.
And I may be wrong about this, but I've never come across, in the Christian tradition, I've never come across this distinction between that which is beyond creation and, as he says here in the last line, Lord, which is the Lord of creation. I may be wrong about that, but I haven't come across it. Eckhart does not see any value in seeking God in a particular way. He says that you end up getting the way and missing God. Therefore, he does not particularly recommend so-called holy practices or holy places. He says that rather than doing holy works, one should make all one's works holy. From Sermon 6. See, those are all merchants who, while avoiding mortal sin and wishing to be virtuous, do good works, such as fasts, vigils, prayers, and the rest, all kinds of good works, but they do them in order that our Lord may give them something in return, or that God may do something they wish for. All these are merchants. That is plain to see, for they want to give one thing in exchange for another, and so barter with our Lord. The law of karma is supreme and overrides all our activities in the universe. Our actions bring about our future. It is common for us to consider that good actions bring about a favourable future, and for bad actions to bring about the opposite. However, in the Bhagavad Gita, Lord Krishna explains that all action binds, and that in order to be free, one must give up the fruits of all action. Krishna also explains that the way to do this is to dedicate all one's actions to the Supreme. This releases one from the inevitable consequences, which could be good or bad. Somewhere it says that all action binds, and that the only difference is that the chains which bind for good karma are golden, and for bad karma, they are iron. There are two verses. The next slide shows two translations of the same verse, which is in the Gita, chapter 3, verse 30.
Deferring all actions to me, meditating on the Supreme Spirit, having become free from desire and selfishness, with your fever departed, fight. Therefore, surrendering thy actions unto me, thy thoughts concentrated on the Absolute, free from selfishness and without anticipation of reward, with mind devoid of excitement, begin thou to fight.
Here, Krishna is instructing Arjuna, who is refusing to fight because he thinks it will bring bad karma. All ideas of I am the doer are formed as a result of attachment. We are very identified in this way. In the Ramakrishna version of the Gita, the commentator gives this example. It is egoism to identify the self with the non-self. Two trains stand side by side in a railway station. A passenger in one train fixes his gaze on the other. When the other train moves, the man fancies that his own vehicle moves. Likewise, the mobility of Prakriti, the Sanskrit term meaning creation, is imposed on the immobile Atman. Bondage persists as long as egoism lasts. The egoistic man thinks of himself as the doer, while actually he is not. Egoism and agency are the outcome of ignorance. Eckhart says that detachment is the highest virtue, and that any time we think we can contribute something ourselves, it is because we want to be, and in fact believe ourselves to be, separate from God. In his words, distinct. It is this very idea that sets us apart and makes us distinct. Whereas if only we were indistinct, then we would actually be God. He goes even further and distinguishes God, which is of the creation, to the Godhead, which is beyond, and perhaps is best described as no thing. Because if it was something, then it would be in creation. Returning to the birth of the word in Sermon 4, Eckhart tells us that all we must not consider that any of our own attributes will help us, and the only quality we require is to be receptive, which requires emptiness and silence.
And so, in truth, if you would find this noble birth, you must leave the crowd and return to the source and ground whence you came. All the powers of the soul and all their works, these are the crowd. Memory, understanding, and will, they all diversify you, and therefore you must leave them all. Sense perceptions, imagination, or whatever may be that in which you find or seek to find yourself. After that, you may find this birth, but not otherwise, believe me. He was never yet found among friends, nor among kindred or acquaintances. There, rather one loses him altogether.
Accordingly, the question arises whether a man can find this birth in any things, which, though divine and yet brought in from without through the senses, such as any ideas about God as being good, wise, compassionate, or anything the intellect can conceive in itself that is in fact divine. Whether a man can find this birth in all these. In fact, he cannot. For although all this is good and divine, it is all brought in from without through the senses.
But all must well up from within, out of God, if this birth is to shine forth truly and clearly, and all your activity must cease, and all your powers must serve his ends, not your own. If this work is to be done, God alone must do it, and you must just suffer it to be. Where you truly go out from your will and your knowledge, God with his knowledge surely and willingly goes in and shines there clearly. Where God will thus know himself, there your knowledge cannot subsist and is of no avail. Do not imagine that your reason can grow to the knowledge of God. If God is to shine divinely in you, your natural light cannot help toward this end. Instead, it must become pure nothing and go out of itself altogether, and then God can shine in with his light, and he will bring back in with him all that you forsook and 1,000 times more, together with a new form to contain it all.
Now you might say, well, sir, what use is my intellect then, if it is supposed to be empty and functionless? Is that the best thing for me to do, to raise my mind to an unknowing knowledge that can't really exist? For if I knew anything at all, it would not be ignorance, and I should not be empty and bare. Am I supposed to be in total darkness?
Certainly, you cannot do better than to place yourself in darkness and in unknowing.
Oh, sir, must everything go then? And is there no turning back?
No, indeed. By rights, there is no returning.
There is a story in Yoga Vasishta, and please note in this story that if it says he or one, it's because we have to use language, and so one has, please sort of bear with it. But briefly, it says that there is a realm where there is a king who is nothing but one omnipotent, omnipresent, supreme light, and he remains silent. This is the supreme absolute Brahman, or for Eckhart, the Godhead. It then says that prompted by him, his minister does everything. The minister himself is totally ignorant, but does everything for his master. So it is the minister who performs all actions. The minister is so powerful that he cannot be defeated even by the most powerful gods. The only one who can defeat the minister is the master. The minister is so powerful that the whole of creation only comes into being and dissolves with the ministers coming and going. Without the minister, there is no creation. The creation only exists when the minister is present. This story is being told by a father to his son. And the father says to his son, you must, by any means possible, and regardless of the difficulties, conquer that minister. He eventually explains to his son that the king, the master, is the self who transcends all other realms and states of consciousness. The minister is the mind that has made all the world as pots of clay. When the mind is conquered, everything is conquered. Remember that the mind is almost invisible, except through intelligent practice. Later on in Yoga Vasishtha, it is said that
only when one is filled with goodness is one qualified to listen to the exposition of the highest wisdom. Hence, one should constantly endeavor to educate the mind with purifying knowledge and nourish it with the inner transformation brought about by the study of scriptures. When the mind has thus been transformed, it is able to reflect the truth without distortion. Then, without delay, one should endeavor to see the self.
note it is only when the mind is transformed that it is able to reflect the truth without distortion. The only way to transform the mind is through stillness. I do not believe it is possible to do stillness. It comes about when everything has been let go, detachment, and all craving and egotism have fallen away. As in so many teachings, one is encouraged to do nothing, more undoing than doing. This turns out to be far more difficult because it requires complete detachment and a complete giving up of desires and egoism. To conclude, Ramakrishna and Meister Eckhart want us to taste the fruit. To do this, one has to remain detached, and ultimately one has to offer up the fruit to the Supreme. This is brought about by achieving stillness of the mind. Ultimately, one has to give up the fruit. Then one sees clearly. Then there is knowing, a knowing which has no object and is more like an unknowing. Eckhart says we should want nothing other than God, by which he is referring to the Godhead. In essence, there is no distinction between the individual and the Godhead. Realizing this is the fruit, and according to Eckhart, in the words I quoted you earlier, this is the experience of being what you were when you were not. I would like to end with the following quotation from Sermon 84. A master says, there is nothing so like God as being. Insofar as it has being, it is like God. A master says that being is so pure and so lofty that all that God is being. God knows nothing but being. He is conscious of nothing but being. Being is his circumference. God loves nothing but his being. He thinks of nothing but his being. I say, all creatures are one being.